Hello, we're here to discuss new rules in conjunction with the new Project Syndicate magazine, New Rules. First, there was a world-changing COVID pandemic, and then the world has changed even more on February 24th, when Russian President Vladimir Putin started war in Ukraine, or that's how they call it in Russia, a special military operation. I'm Nina Khrushcheva, professor of international affairs at the New School in New York, and an editor of Project Syndicate's Window into Russia section. Well, with sanctions going on today and the war raging on, it is now more like a keyhole into Russia. I'm honored to discuss these new rules with Javier Solana, who is the president of ESADE, Center for Global Economy and Geopolitics in Barcelona and Madrid. Thank you, Dr. Solana. Javier, if I may, for joining us.
Thank you very much, Nina. It's a pleasure to see you, even if it's through this technological machine.
Well, we're lucky to have those machines today. Dr. Solana, of course, which is very important for our conversation, was NATO's Secretary General in the 1990s when it was going through major changes after the Soviet Union collapse and what seemed to be the end of the Cold War confrontations, or so it seemed then. And in the first decade of the 20th century, he was also Secretary General of the Council of European Union and was a de facto the foreign minister. So if I may start this conversation asking you about the 90s and the 2000s, this first 20 years after the Cold War ended, because you essentially helped creating the rule book for the post-Cold War world in both military and foreign policy relations. So has February 24th changed it forever, or something can be still salvaged?
I think that when I was NATO Secretary General, I thought, and many other people thought, that we should have or try to have a solid, coherent policy with Russia. At that time, when I'm talking, Yeltsin was the president of Russia, and as you know, we started an important negotiation to see if we could explain and be accepted by the Russians the opening of NATO to third countries. For that, we started a negotiation in January, and my partner on the other side, but Russia, was Yevgeny Primakov. Yevgeny Primakov was a solid man. I had great respect for him, and we negotiated from January, let's say, to the month of March. And it was a tough negotiation, as you can imagine, but it was a good negotiation. We finished it in a period of time, not very long, and with a great success. And the success was that we signed an agreement between NATO and Russia, and we created a NATO-Russia Council. And at the same time, the Russians accepted a first opening of NATO. And that took place in Madrid in 1997. It was a satisfactory summit in which the three countries at the time, Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia, at that time was still united, started the process to enter into NATO. I'd like to say that the founding act, it was signed by me and signed by President Yeltsin. So it was something that was agreed between NATO and Russia. I thought that was a big success. It lasted, that happiness of that agreement, a certain time in which we were working together.
I have a follow-up question then. So you are saying that 97, 98, 99, it was all mutual in terms of expanding NATO, and Russians agreed to that. They've been, in recent years, and particularly in the last year, there've been numerous amount of publications suggesting that, in fact, Yeltsin was duped, that he didn't quite understand that because apparently, according to some sources, Bill Clinton told him, well, the further expansion is not going to be in your lifetime, and so you shouldn't really worry. So Yeltsin kind of agreed, but he didn't mean to agree. And after 1990, when the two Germanys reunited, in fact, there was a promise, which of course Russians have been talking about incessantly. There's been a promise that NATO would not get expanded. I was a research assistant, research assistant of George Kennan, the great American diplomat, the author of the X article, The Sources of Soviet Conduct. And in 1997 and 1998, he was writing letters to Stroop Talbot, who you remember, of course, at the time was Undersecretary of State in the Bill Clinton administration, saying, whatever your ideas are now, do not expand NATO, because even if Russians would, swallow it now, they have no other choice. Ultimately, would influence Russian politics. It would influence their behavior. And some would say that, in fact, George Kennan's predictions have come true, because now that expansion is cited as something that Vladimir Putin wants to go back to. He wants to go back to 1997. So in your understanding, do you suggest that probably it is a very selective way of looking at history, of the first cycle of post-Cold War cycle NATO expansion?
Lina, what I could tell you is what I lived, and I cannot lie about that. That agreement was signed. That agreement is true that it was to the summit in Madrid enlarged to 3 countries, today 4, because Czechoslovakia has broken into 2. And that is what we agreed. I didn't have any sentiment of not wanting to do this agreement, this first agreement. I think that the next enlargements of NATO were not done with the same care, the same person-to-person negotiation. The Russians, how much they care about being respected. And I tried to be very respectful to Russia, but I didn't find any great difficulty. Yevgeny Primakov was a tough negotiator. You probably know that very well, but he was a sound personality, somebody you can trust, and we achieved that. And I do think, and I would like to see your interpretation, I think that the sentiment of Putin after September 11, September 11 was very important, we remember both, because of the change in foreign policy of the United States. The United States, at a given moment, may I say, forgot everything but the fight against Bin Laden. And for several years, the relationship with Russia were not of the same caliber, the same connection than they were before. The relationship with the President Bush, the father, were much better than they were with Bush, the son. Bush, the son, was much more occupied in the Middle East and the question pertaining to Bin Laden and the September 11. And it may happen that at this moment, Putin he was not that important. He was not taken as he expected to be taken once the September 11 took place. And to complicate a little bit more the perception of Putin, remember that the second part of 1990, the second part of the first year of the century, 2000, was also very important that China entered into the WTO. And that was also a very important achievement for China. So it was a moment in which the United States changed their foreign policy, and China got a push, tremendous push economic, and at the same time, Putin was there, I wouldn't say with whom to talk, but not played the role that he expected to be played after he was appointed and then later elected president of Russia.
I actually would like to, kind of agree, but I also would like to slightly disagree on that, that Putin didn't feel important. I think that after September 11th, remember when he first called and he was very understanding and sympathetic and almost heartbroken about September 11th, because he himself kept saying, well, we are also been struggling with Islamic fundamentalism in Chechnya at the time, and see how we feel. And I think George Bush at the beginning, remember when he looked into his soul, and looked into his eyes and saw his soul. I think the problem was not necessary. I agree that Putin wasn't important enough for America. I think the problem was not that he wasn't important after September 11th, but he thought that after his behavior, his sort of understanding and this soulful, spiritual, religious connection that he had with George Bush, it didn't go far enough, that Russia was still not part of the equal partner as he thought it should be. And I think that began to change his perception.
Indeed, I agree with you. We are saying the same, basically. Now, what is more important, what is less important, but at the end of the day, I always thought that Putin may be a little bit unhappy with what he expected to be a leader of the world, a big power, and in that year, the beginning of the century, he was not considered such a big power, let's put it that way. Or he thought that he was not considered as a big power.
No, absolutely. And I think that's exactly, I guess we're both saying the same thing. It was just depending on the time frame we're discussing, because Putin thought he was one of the big boys, the great power. And in 2007, remember that famous Munich speech when he was calling for the new security architecture in which Russia would be a major player, and when he felt it was disregarded or misinterpreted or misunderstood. And that the Putin, I now call him the baby Putin, the Putin that had some threats against the world.
Let me move it. I'm going to describe how I lived in 2004. 2004 was a very important year because Ukraine entered for the first time in crisis with Russia, really, and in crisis with the rest of the world. And remember that it was presidential elections in Ukraine. There were two candidates, basically, one Yanukovych and the other Viktor Yushchenko. Yanukovych was the candidate of Putin, and Yushchenko was the candidate of the people in the Orange Revolution, let's put it that way. And remember that the elections took place and they were not accepted by a good part of the society, and it had to be repeated. Remember that. And I was negotiating at that time with Chernomyrdin, that was the ambassador in Ukraine from Russia, and then even with the president of the Duma, and accompanied by the president of at that time of Poland, Alexander Waniewski. And we were able to convince everybody that the election should be repeated, and they were repeated. The candidate of Putin lost, and the candidate of Viktor Yushchenko won. And that was the first time that I saw Putin entering into the domestic policy of Ukraine with selecting a candidate, Yanukovych, and losing the battle. For him, that election were very important, and I think he was very mad that his candidate didn't win. How do you see that?
No, I agree. I think that was the first time when he felt that Ukraine is something that is slipping from under the Russian kind of the Slavic world thumb or something like that. So no, absolutely. I think there's many steps that led us to today. I have a question. You wrote a very excellent piece before this NATO summit, because you mentioned the first summit, then there was a new one just recently. After 25 years, there was a new the new NATO summit in Madrid with an entirely new set of issues to discuss, with a new program. So you wrote a piece for Project Syndicate discussing the summit or the future of the summit, and how Europe, with the strengthening of its military muscle and having more unity and more members, because now there's Putin wanted less members. Now it has now NATO has more, so which is Sweden and Finland. So how do you assess the outcomes of the summit? Because you set up the decisions that they needed to make, but the outcomes were, I mean, we expected that it would happen, but now it's important that it did happen. Russia is a major threat for NATO, and China is a strategic challenge. So how do you assess the entirely new, different sort of even a new rule book for relationship with these two global powers?
As an observer, I really think that the summit had been a great success. It has been a great success for many reasons. But you have mentioned one that was not expected, which is the invitation to Finland and Sweden to be part of NATO. Now, this is something that nobody had in mind. At the time before the summit, the two countries were very relaxed, being neutrals. But the big mistake of Putin with the military operation in Ukraine, it made two neutral countries of the European Union, both members of the European Union, to rethink their position about neutrality. And that is a very bad news for Putin, because they were concerned about Ukraine going into NATO, and then they had two neighbors much closer almost than Ukraine, or as close as Ukraine physically, that decided to enter into NATO. So from that point of view, the summit is a very bad news for Putin.
Okay, so then a follow-up question, because I was reading reports on this, and in Chinese press and a Russian press, I don't know if you know about that or don't, or you do not. So they say that, of course, it's a joke that that NATO is a defensive alliance. Of course, it is an offensive alliance. It's the greatest joke of the century, and it's all serving American hegemony and so on. But as somebody who, from the NATO side, I mean, of course, you're no longer a NATO official, but somebody from a NATO side argue against it, or so it's presented. I don't know if you've seen those reports on the Chinese official media, and so in Russia as well. So according to them, you are saying global NATO and NATO plus could actually be a damaging thing, that NATO is going to be part of the Asia-Pacific theater or Asia-Pacific defense, because that could divide the world into further adversarial blocs on par with NATO and what used to be the Warsaw Pact. So it could become actually more divisive to the world, those adding China, at least as a strategic challenge, than it was before. Did you ever say anything like that?
When we talk about China, we offer very clearly to China the possibility of keep on talking, keep on cooperating, and trying to see that what you said, that the world does not divide into two. I mean, the most difficult thing that we have today is the possibility of an uncoupling of the world. This is something we have to do do our most for not happening. An uncoupled world with, let's say, two types of globalization, one around China and the other around the Western world, I think it would be a big mistake, because the big problems of the world, let's put, for example, the climate change, cannot be resolved by any of the two parts alone. So we are dividing something, and at the same time, we are recognizing that if we do that, we will not resolve the real serious problems of the world.
I don't know if you know that you haven't been in European politics for over 10 years, in the European Union politics for over 10 years, but you're still very much remembered as a great diplomat. And in fact, I was meeting with somebody close to the Kremlin to kind of try to assess what's going on. and this person mentioned you and said, where is Dr. Solana? Because we were able, and that fits into what you were saying about your conversations with Chernomyrdin and Primakov, that when we were able to solve all these complex problems, and so now in European diplomacy, as this person put to me, there is a crisis of human resources, and so we need more Solanas to that extent. So it is important that you, even in the face of this horrible war, you able to want to and provide some arguments to think about global affairs. If I may ask you, go back to Putin, since he is, obviously this very big elephant in the room at all times. What would you say to the Russians, that particularly now they've been saying that Russian security architecture was constantly disregarded with this expansion of NATO? We went through the expansion of NATO, but generally, does he have a point in saying that Russian role in the world or in European security was always diminished, and therefore he says he had to act in order to be understood and noticed? Otherwise, Russia would have had a war with Europe, with NATO and the United States being a leader of all these organizations.
But Nina, let me say that when Putin arrives to the presidency, as we have recognized, appeared to be somebody with whom you could deal. But by 2004, he was already in a situation because of the concern he had about Ukraine. The Ukraine for him has been a big mistake. Remember, in 2014, the European Union and Ukraine, we were negotiating an agreement for trade. And that was something, not a big thing for Ukraine. It was important, but it was not solving all the problems. But at that time, Putin gets very furious. The beginning of the war is there, because after that, after Yanukovych disappeared, Putin took Crimea, and maybe we did not respond sufficiently clear and rapidly to the taking of Crimea.
Yes, I actually do think it was a mistake. I thought that the total sanctions, the way they're doing it now, actually should have been imposed already then, because that was the security state, the KGB state that now Russia was much weaker at the time. I mean, it was already there, obviously, Putin himself being a KGB man and people surrounding him, but it was a much weaker state, much weaker KGB state at the time. But it is sort of, what you point out is really quite an interesting exercise in tactics versus strategy, because Putin does appear to be afraid to lose his sphere of influence, as he was with the associated agreement with Ukraine, now with expansion of NATO, and instead he actually gets more animosity in strategic terms rather than less, even if he thinks that tactically, say, he got Crimea, or say he was able to at least take parts of the Donetsk, the Donbas region in the last 4 months since the operation has gone on. So tactically, he may think that he is victorious, but strategically, obviously, it has been an absolute and will be an absolute disaster for Russia. What are the roles of other organizations? What about the United Nations? What about the Security Organization in Europe? Have they really failed in this past year, in the last 4, 5, 6 months, to provide some sort of security or some sort of guidance and leadership in global affairs?
I think the United Nations has not played any role in this conflict. And for me, it's sad, because it is true that we are talking about a conflict between countries which are, two of them at least, or several of them are part of the Security Council members. And therefore, when you have the Security Council members in different camps, it's very difficult for the Secretary General to do something. But I think it should have been done something, even if at the end was not achieve anything, at least to give the sentiment to the people of the world that United Nations tries.
I was going to ask you about China as well. So how is the conflict has influenced Chinese behavior? And for example, there's a lot of talk that it can stop Xi Jinping if he decides to go into Taiwan, seeing the NATO response, the European response, the American response. Does Xi Jinping want to go into Taiwan at all?
Well, I think that we have enough problems on the table today, and I don't think that we should be playing with using another potential problems to complicate more the world. I think on the opposite, we have to concentrate on resolving this big problem, which has consequences, as I said before, also for the people in Africa, and try to resolve that. The question on Taiwan can wait, and it's not a drama today. There's nothing is happening there. So let's not create another source of preoccupation with Taiwan today. We cannot open all the problems at the same time. Problem with Russian, problem with the Chinese. This will drive us crazy, and the world will really enter into a phase of practically a global situation of conflict.
This is an excellent answer, because I myself always kind of shave when people start lumping Ukraine and other global problems together, as if we're looking for another war while we're still dealing with this one. But I do agree with you. I think it's very well put that negotiations ultimately would be the solution to this, at least in this particular phase of the problem. I want to thank you. It's very kind of you to let me call you Xavier, which is wonderful. Thank you very much. I'm very honored to be talking to you. The magazine were Project Syndicate's new magazine, New Rules. Hopefully we'll give some answers, or at least we'll do some sort of room for conversation. Thank you.
Nina, we are both for Project Syndicate, and for me it has been a pleasure to have the possibility of talking to you. And I would like to do it on a more regular basis. You are in Moscow, you have a good mind, you understand the problems better than anybody else here in Madrid or in Paris. You know much better, and I think it's very important to sense the temperature from somebody which is a Russian, which lives in Moscow, and he believes that the world is much similar to my view than other views. So you and me have more points of connection,
Very good.
It's very good that we continue talking.